Hello, everyone, and welcome to CIT 141 Visual Concepts for Game Design. I'm Professor Olsch, and this week our topic is what is a game asset? Game assets are the all the main components that are used to make a video game. They can include visual Hello, everyone, and welcome to CIT 141 Visual Concepts for Game Design. I'm Professor Olsch, and today's topic is what is a game asset? Game assets are the components that are used to make a video game. They can be visual, they can be audio, they can be scripting and code, animations, and all that stuff. So, we're going to get into each individual component. And explain what they are. So, uh, types of game assets. As I stated, they're visual assets, so things like your models and meshes, as well as UI elements and animations, special effects, visual effects, lighting, things like that. Um, Audio assets include all of your sound effects, all of your music, dialogue, um, ambient noise, and things like that that actually bring your gaming experience kind of wraps it all together with very immersive audio. And then you have your code assets, which are things like your scripts and actual coding that makes your game work. Uh, this can be functions that affect interactivity with characters or objects in the world, things to tell the game what to do next, where to put you, what level to load, and stuff like that. So let's talk about 2D assets. Now, when we are making games in 3D spaces, we don't necessarily think too much about what 2D assets actually use. Um, if we're making a 2D game, a side-scrolling platformer, or a old school RPG, or something of that nature, a older console game like a Nintendo or Super Nintendo game, we think a lot more about 2D assets like sprites. Sprites are 2D representations of objects and characters inside of a game. Um, they are, at their core, using pixel art, usually pixel art. Sometimes you'll use actual hand drawn art. If you've ever played Cuphead, this is what Cuphead does. And usually they are far more simplistic in their look, because what you're using them in is something that's far less graphically intensive. However, there's a lot that is used to make up a sprite, and the animations and actions that sprites take inside of 2D games. In the example on the slide here, you'll see what looks to be a movement cycle, a walking cycle for this sprite. When we are um, designing sprites, we do it in what's called a sprite sheet. Sprite sheets contain all of the different positions that a sprite can be in. So, for instance, in this movement cycle, you have the sprite walking, standing still, walking with the other foot, standing still, in both right facing and left facing orientation. If this was a 4 direction or an 8 direction movement type game, you would also have them moving in forward and backwards and in diagonal. If the sprite had an attack or an action that it did, a jump, swinging a sword, all of those would be individually set in the sprite sheet. When applying sprite sheets to video game animations, usually you would tell your game engine to look at the sprite sheet in individual frames, and render each of those sprites at the right time. However, that's not the only way that we use 2D assets in video games, especially in 3D games. While we can use sprites in 3D games, a lot of times what we'll see, especially when we use Unreal Engine, is we use sprites and sprite sheets for visual effects. If you've ever looked really closely at fire in a video game or smoke, you'll see that a lot of times it's actually made up of a bunch of different flat images the of the effect, and they're animating in some pattern or random movement. Those individual images are all sprites. In most cases, sometimes we will use actual uh, meshes for special effects, but they can be a lot more graphically intensive and a lot heavier on your components when running the game, and very expensive. And it's not necessarily something that we want to spend a lot of our power when we're trying to make sure the game runs well on different systems, computers, or consoles. The biggest type of 2D asset that we'll use in 3D game development, especially in Unreal Engine, is textures. Textures are, in the example here, you can see they are 2D representations of the look and feel of an object. And usually in game design, they are put on top of a 3D mesh to give it its color, to give it its shape, and its texture. This example, we have a cobblestone road or cobblestone wall, where you can see a bunch of different stones. But if you look at the actual 3D representation of it, you'll see there's a lot of depth inside of it that can a lot of times be attributed to what's called normals, which is this image right here. So we'll get way more into detail on texture mapping and normals and giving actual depth to objects through flat textures. But the basics of a normal texture is to give that depth, to actually make it look or act like it is far more detailed than just a flat plane. The other 2D asset that we really focus on a lot in game design, both 2D and 3D, is UI elements. One of the biggest things that I do in Dogwood is doing UI design. So UI in general is represented in flat images that are put on top of your viewport in a game. So when you open up a menu, it's a flat image of a menu and has all of the different buttons and interactivity. These are all represented by 2D objects, specifically most of the time renders of 2D images in PNG, JPEG, TIFF format. And so those are the major ways that we use 2D assets in video games. Next, let's talk about 3D assets. So 3D assets have a couple of different names, and the biggest ones that we'll talk about are kind of similar in their definition. So models, which inside of games, models are your 3D representations of your objects. These models, when we talk about models, are complete. So they will have their shape, their geometry, and also all of the texture, the material assets that make it look and act the way that it's supposed to inside of a scene. Then there's meshes, and meshes are kind of the stripped down version of models. So when you look at meshes, they're the geometric structure. And if you look at, and as you work in Maya, you'll notice that everything is done geometrically. These meshes are what we're going to be making inside of Maya. And they're the simple geometric versions of what models become when they're finished and placed in a scene. Meshes are all set up. Meshes are made up of three different major components. They are made up of vertices, edges, and faces. Vertices are points in between edges. Think of them as points in a shape, the corners of a square. Edges are the lines that make up that shape, so they're the edges of the square, the sides. And then faces are the part that is the flat representation of that shape, so the center of the square. In these images here, you can see this cube. The vertices are the 4 points in the square of this face. The edges are the lines, and then the face is the gray part itself. Simple geometric designs like cubes, spheres, and cones, as well as planes and whatnot, all have very uniform geometry. Their faces and vertices and edges are all very equal to each other in size and shape. But then when you get into more complex designs, you will be extruding and transforming those different objects or those different components to create the shapes that you're trying to go for. The next and most complex part of 3D assets are rigged characters, skeletal meshes, as they're called in Unreal Engine. Skeletal meshes are things that are given a skeleton so that they can be animated. In 3D animation, you use a bone structure, which are basically virtual handles inside of an object that allow you to manipulate how they are, how they move. So in the example here of this Minotaur guy, all of those little pyramid shapes all over his body are the different bone points. Usually in a skeletal meshes skeleton, each bone represents a major connection between different animated parts in a body. So your elbow to your wrist, that's a bone, or your different digits in your fingers. In addition, your pelvis to the center of your torso, that spine bone, that can be separated in a couple different sections to get more articulation. But these are usually used for your characters, cars, things with moving components, and they are things that can be assigned animations. Next up is audio assets. This is as simple as it sounds. There's sound effects, ambient sounds, music. In addition to that, there's audio dialogue, your voice acting of characters. In game development, what we do, sound effects are usually placed and activated at times when they make sense, like a gun firing or breaking glass, swinging a hammer, things like that will make specific sounds and they'll be activated at those times. Ambient sounds are usually things you hear in the background, things that don't necessarily have an activator, but they are things that help enhance a scene. So you have your birds chirping in the background, or one of my favorites in our current game is the ambient noise of vending machines running, refrigeration, computers running in the background, humming, things like that. And then there's music, which is pretty self-explanatory. It's the background music and um, the cinematic tracks that help elevate the mood and the tone of your scene and your game. And music is usually presented in ways that make sense artistically for the scene. Same thing as it would be used in a movie or a TV show. Usually, when we deal with music, we have our main tracks, our title theme, and credit themes and stuff, and then you have your combat, your ambient music that are played at certain times during gameplay. Next up, animations. So this is pretty specific to game development itself. We treat animations as their own assets in a game. When you work in something like Unreal Engine, your animation files will be very similar to your 3D asset files. So Most of the time, they are .fbx in Unreal, and that's what we'll be making is .fbx files during this class. And that FBX format contains animation data. So it contains morphs of the different bones from a skeletal mesh in their positions based off of the world to allow things like animation to take place. Animations can include things like your walk cycle, as basic as it is. 1 foot in front of the other, left, right. Attack animations, effect animations, so swinging a sword or casting a spell, any kind of visual feedback for actions in a game. Facial expressions, when we get down to character scenes where you have dialogue, when you have lip syncing, when you have actual communication between characters and there's reactions, surprise, fear, things like that. When you get into really high fidelity designs for games, you get into very realistic video facial expressions. Can get into cool things like motion capture to create those those tiny facial expressions. All right, next up, the last thing that we're going to discuss for game assets is scripting and coding. These are the behaviors, interactions, the game logic, the things that make the game play the way that it should. So, behaviors are things that characters and objects in the game would react to other actions that happen in the game. The example that I've used in this image is a behavior tree in Unreal Engine for AI. So how a enemy interacts in combat, how an NPC walks down the street in a town, things like that. Interactions, on the other hand, are things that handle interactions between objects and characters that interact with them in a scene, such as when you open a door and you loot treasure, triggering dialogue, stuff like that. Then there's game logic, which is specifically the code that manages the rules, mechanics of a game, how gameplay is plays out, how players score, level up, change levels, go into and out of rooms or dungeons, teleport, things like that. And all of the things that are actually affecting gameplay. For the most part, we are not going to be handling much scripting in this class, but it's important to know that these are also assets inside of a game project. Okay, so how do we put all of this together? How do we integrate these assets into our game? There's a workflow that, for the most part, we follow in game development. And it starts with asset creation. So the artist will create whatever the component is, whether it's a visual thing, an audio thing, a code asset, whether it's a 3D model, a song, a animation, whether it's a piece of code or a script that does a certain thing. Those things will be created, and then they'll be placed into our engine software. So for us, it's Unreal Engine. Where if you've actually like worked in Unreal. Okay, so how do we put all this together? Now, integrating assets is a process, a workflow that we. I don't like that. All right, so how do we put all of this together? So we will discuss. All right, so let's put all of this together. So how do you integrate these assets into our game? This is a workflow that we use in game development that starts with creating whatever the asset is. So whether it's an artist creating a 3D object or a 2D object or a song, a visual effect, or if it's a programmer creating a script or a piece of code that does a certain thing for a project or for a game, those things are first created and then they're added to our engine software. So the next step would be asset management, where you would organize the objects that are the assets that are being added to the project to make sure that they're easily accessible. When you're organizing, say, 3D objects, those meshes and their textures and all of that need to be sorted in ways that are easily accessible and you understand that they are what they are. It is also very important to think about naming conventions. You want to make sure that your 3D models are named in a way that you know what they are, and the materials and textures that are used on those models are named in a way that you can identify where they're supposed to go and what they're supposed to actually color, um, and so on. The next would be implementation of those assets. So this can mean placing sound effects where they're supposed to go off, coding in the interactions that are supposed to make them happen, making sure that the animations are triggered when they're supposed to. When you press the attack button, you actually swing your sword or fire your gun, things like that. In addition, it is important to make sure that they interact the way that they're supposed to. This is where you get into a lot of scripting. So your user interface, when you press buttons to open up menus or to select items in your inventory, that they actually do what they're supposed to. And the last part is something that may get skipped over quite a bit when you think about game development, but it is very important and probably one of the things that I spend the most of my time doing once objects are created, and that's testing and refinement. You have to ensure that all of the things that you've placed in your game actually work properly. And that's not just to say that there are no bugs in your code, but also that your 3D assets and your sound effects look and sound the way that they're supposed to. A lot of times you may drop a skeletal mesh into a project, give it an animation, and it looks fine from your viewport in your engine, but when you actually build and play your game, it doesn't do what it's supposed to. An arm goes the wrong way, or it skips, or what you thought was a looping walking cycle is actually half of that. And you have to debug and edit either your assets themselves or the code that makes them work to get that to work properly. Testing is the most important factor in game development, um, for the players, from the player's perspective, because if a player is playing a game that is not tested and is full of bugs or broken animations and sound effects and things like that, they're not going to have a very good time playing the game. I'm sure we've all played games that are very buggy from the outset, and from release you'll have developers say, oh well, we have to release a patch day one for this fix or this fix. These are things that we try to minimize by doing testing. I believe that was the last slide that I had for this week. To run through everything real fast, again, our assets include 2D and 3D visual objects, audio assets such as music and sound effects, your coding and scripting parts that make the game run the way that it's supposed to, and animations that allow your objects in the game to move and interact in the ways that you want it to. All of that gets put together and then coded and plugged into a working, cohesive game. Thank you, everybody, for listening to this lecture on what is a game asset. I will talk to you guys next time.